Today's guest is co-author of Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa, vice chairman at Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, a coordinator for the Schiller Institute, vice chairman of BRICS, the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, and a distinguished research fellow at the Guangdong Institute for International Strategies. Welcome to the bridge.
Thank you, Jason. It's my great honor to be on your show. Happy to be with you again.
Yeah, this is your second time on the show. I'm really happy to have you back. I have so many more questions that are actually in the bullet points, so let's get straight to it. You recently wrote an article, Plans for 2063 should be launched now for China Daily. Can you tell us about how, well, firstly, for people who don't know, the African Union was founded as the Africa Unity in 1963, and they have a vision for Africa for 2063. Can you tell us how China can help the African Union achieve its 2063 vision?
Yeah, well, this was we had this forum on China-Africa cooperation recently in Beijing, which was an amazing demonstration of the enormous potential which exists in the global South. And also there's a completely new paradigm in international relations, which is manifest in this fantastic relationship between China and Africa. And President Xi Jinping made it very clear that this is a friendship relationship. This is not a pragmatic, geopolitical, or anything. This is about friendship, which makes it a completely different quality, where you understand what the concept of a community of a shared future for humankind. This is what it means. It means we are one big family. We are different nations, we have different cultures, we have different political systems, but we are like a brotherhood somehow. And this removes all the differences, all the complexities among nations. And the outcome of this summit was so amazing. It was, first of all, this was the largest one because the FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, started already in 2002. But this was like this is the 9th meeting, held. Sometimes it's held in Africa, sometimes held in China. This was the largest one, but also it's interesting that the leaders of Africa before the summit, they visited many Chinese cities to see the modernization which has taken place and firsthand get a touchy-feely understanding of how China managed to do that. Remember, China in the 60s, 70s was poorer than most African nations. And the president of Zimbabwe, he said, he came to China 60 years ago, he said, and he has seen the enormous shift. So the idea, this summit, what should put on the table is modernization and industrialization. That Africa, for example, and most countries in the global South will no longer accept the situation where they are at the bottom of the supply chain, where they export raw materials to the world and they import expensive finished goods into Africa. This is the source of most problems in Africa. In the article, which was published actually the first day of the summit on the front page of the China Daily, I wrote, it's like, Africa is like a big, wonderful tree, but its fruits always falls behind the fence. Other people benefit from Africa's fruit, but the people of Africa benefit very little. And this has been a relationship since the colonial times where African resources were looted, African human resources were taken away as slaves to benefit other countries, produce things for other countries. In the post-colonial period, we had a similar situation, although the mechanisms changed. That under new agreements with the former colonial powers and new rules of the so-called rules-based order, for example, under the direction of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, Africa was put into a situation where this colonial system was perpetuated, where Africa continued to export raw materials and import finished goods, and its financial resources were flying outside the continent, and its human resources, the best educated people, were snatched away or they had to flee the continent to work in other places. So this very absurd situation continued, and it's the source of poverty, it's the source of instability in Africa. Now, African nations, there's a new world situation. China has shown the way that you cannot accept to be, at the end of the supply chain. You have to become part of the supply chain. And this what the FOCAC represented. I can just reference two important statements by President Xi Jinping. One was 10 years ago at the FOCAC summit in Johannesburg in South Africa. And it's important to listen to President Xi Jinping when he speaks, because he's not just making some nice rhetorics. In 2015, he said, it's entirely possible for Africa as the world's most promising region. Remember that the economists, for example, many years ago said Africa is a hopeless continent. President Xi Jinping said this is the most promising region in terms of potential to bring into play its advantages and achieve great success. The achievement of inclusive and sustainable development in Africa hinges on industrialization, which holds the key to creating jobs, eradicating poverty, and improving people's living standards. That was 10 years ago. What happened 10 years ago? China promised to resolve, at the same speech, President Xi Jinping spoke about 3 bottlenecks of development. And he said it's the lack of capital, the lack of infrastructure, and the lack of skilled labor. And in all these fields, China did enormous work to resolve these 3 bottlenecks of development. Now, in this last week's summit, President Xi Jinping opened his keynote speech to the African leaders by saying a very beautiful statement. He says, blossoms in spring turn into fruits in autumn, and a bumper harvest is the reward of hard work. It says, in this season of harvest, I am delighted to gather together with so many old and new friends in Beijing to discuss grand plans for Africa, for China-Africa friendship and cooperation in the new era. Now, the blossoms of the spring were like 10 years ago, and now is the time for harvest. This is what President Xi Jinping is talking about. So this is the kind of thing which is taking place now. African nations are looking forward to get the technology, the infrastructure, and the skills to become part of the supply chains. Now there you have, because there's an infrastructure, it's not enough yet. We need much more. We need more power production. We need more transport. We need more water projects. We need telecommunications, all kinds of things, which China is willing to supply. But now we have industrial zones, industrial parks popping up all over Africa. And this is what is the game changer. And the nations like Zimbabwe, they have banned the export of raw lithium. They say, we're not going to export raw lithium cheap to other countries where they can turn it into batteries and sell it back to us for 10 times the price. We have to shift that. We want to build the battery factories in Zimbabwe. The same goes for copper, iron, all the rare minerals. Most nations in Africa say now, you want a good deal with us, you build industries here. We want the added value here. We can share with you the added value, but you don't take 100%. We want 50-50. This is what is win-win. And African nations have seen what modernization and industrialization does by seeing what happened in China, the enormous development in China, and they cannot accept anything less than that anymore. So that's where the big game changer is taking place, and African nations will tell the same thing to Western powers. We have to get back sovereignty over our natural resources, human resources. We no longer accept the old system. This is a new world. And also there are other things which, for example, Africa's enormous financial problems, they come from both from this, that they export cheap raw materials, they import expensive finished goods. They have to borrow dollar to buy food. Can you imagine this? Africa imports 85% of the staple food it needs. Africa 3 times larger than China. 2/3 of Africa's land is arable. There are enormous water resources. So Africa can produce food for the whole world. But imagine this, for 70 years, Africa's agriculture has been destroyed and become dependent on importing wheat, maize, rice from Ukraine, Russia, Australia, United States. And what they do in return, the IMF is telling them, well, these are expensive things. These are technology intensive. You can produce fruits and vegetables to export to Europe and other countries. So you can get cash with which you buy finished, like wheat and rice and bread. And Africa says, this is over. We cannot accept this. So one important part of the China-Africa cooperation now is in the agricultural field. Africa should be able to feed its people. Egypt, for example, one of the big debt issues in Egypt is Egypt that borrows money to buy bread from abroad. This is insane. Most of Egypt's debt crisis is because of the food insecurity. In the 60s, Egypt was self-sufficient in wheat production, but it got destroyed through the so-called reform and opening up Western style, where Henry Kissinger advised the Egyptian government that they could get free wheat and rice from the United States. They don't need to grow it anymore, but they can produce cash crops to export and get dollars. So they destroyed Egypt's, wheat production at home. And thus Egypt became dependent on foreign markets. Let's look at the oil wealth of Africa. Nigeria is one of the large producers of oil in the world. But Nigeria, until last week, had to export raw oil and import fuel. Until last week, it was interesting that with the FOCAC summit, the biggest refinery in Africa finally was opened in Nigeria. When you export raw oil, a barrel could cost $50. Okay, you sell it for $50. But refined products that are made in Europe, in the United States, in Asia, they cost 10 times more. So you are actually losing money by exporting your raw oil. But if you refine the oil, you can get 10 times, 50 times. If you introduce petrochemicals, you try to produce plastics, you produce paint, you produce chemicals, you can get. Morocco has the world's largest phosphate mines, which is useful for fertilizer production. But Morocco does not produce fertilizer. Africa needs to import fertilizer from Russia and Ukraine for very expensive. Ethiopia's big problem with agriculture is their lack of fertilizer. So you have inside Africa phosphate and natural gas, but you cannot produce fertilizer to produce your own food. You see what I mean? Africa has been bankrupted. This is the source of the debt trap. Africa has been in a debt trap. It's not because of China. China and the Belt and Road Initiative are the solution to this debt trap. So Africa's resources will now no longer bleed, and the great tree in Africa, its fruits will fall in the lap of the African people from now on, with modernization, with industrialization. And this is what is fascinating in this situation.
I mean, I think you've already answered the question, but a lot of people keep asking me, in terms of China getting involved in the Belt and Road Initiative and getting involved in developing these special economic zones in Africa. And the people with little knowledge of this say things like, oh, this is just debt trap diplomacy. China is trying to do the same thing to Africa that the former imperial powers in Western Europe and the United States have been doing to Africa for the last several centuries. So how is China's involvement in Africa different than what the West has been doing historically?
Well, what the West has been doing historically is what I explained. Africa is the source of raw materials. And also Africa's little financial resources actually flee the continent and fill the pockets of people in the offshore banking systems. With the corrupt African leaders, we should not, it takes two to tango. African leaders accepted this. We can have many examples where, in the 1960s, with the beginning of the liberation, 50s and 60s liberation movement, you had great leaders, but they were assassinated by the United States and Britain and France. And then you had a new generation of politicians who had to be more pragmatic. With the fall of the Soviet Union, many of the nations who were more on the socialist leaning, like Zambia, I did thorough research on Zambia's debt problems. because they say China has lent money to Zambia. This is all nonsense. All the talk about the China Belt and Road trap is complete nonsense. I have studied many countries. We have explained it thoroughly. Others have done that. There's no shred of evidence of that. But there's ample evidence that it was the Western system which has entrapped African nations into debt. Look at Zambia, for example. In the 1990s, there was a shift in Zambia where all state-owned mining, like copper is a big resource in Africa. It was under the IMF and World Bank direction, it was privatized. Or, the state control was relaxed. So the old British colonial companies came back. There are 7 British, Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, the Commonwealth, the British Crown, they control 60-70% of the copper production in Zambia. And under the rules of the new, what is called the liberal system, the Washington Consensus, where the IMF and World Bank become completely liberal institutions, where the government should not intervene, there shouldn't be taxes, there shouldn't be tariffs. So those 6-7 companies in Zambia, they export the copper and they pay almost nothing back to the Zambian government. They say, oh, we employ people here, we bring some technology, but the resources don't go back to Zambia. And those companies are allowed under these rules to export all their revenues to Britain. So this is the same situation. So Zambia gets like 10% back from the copper production in its own country. And those companies are not interested in refining and producing copper products, like cables and stuff like this inside Zambia, because there is no electricity. So China comes in and says, look, we can build dams, we can build power plants, we can build copper and iron industries where you can have industries here. And then the IMF and World Bank comes in. And Janet Yellen, she flew last year to Zambia, and actually she landed in the airport, which was built by China. It's like there's a new terminal in the Kenneth Kaunda airport. Actually, she landed there. The IMF chief, she also landed at the same airport, which was built with a Chinese loan. But she told you cannot afford to take loans for infrastructure. See, they said, so if Zambia doesn't have electricity and roads and railways and educated labor force, how would they be able to take the copper and iron and the other minerals and turn them into products with 100 times more value? So what the IMF, the US is trying to put Zambia in a situation where poverty will be perpetuated and those British companies will continue to loot the resources of Zambia by telling them don't work with China. What China is trying to do in Zambia is that Zambia could get back sovereignty of its economic processes, but they need, as President Xi Jinping said, you need capital, you need infrastructure, you need skilled labor, and then you can industrialize. This is the new game. This is what African nations say. So the Chinese way of doing things, the loans, if you look at any kind, I just last week, because the Swedish television, they had a very silly report about the FOCAC summit. It's like 50 seconds. First, they show a CGTN clip where people in Gambia or Ghana, they are so happy to export their coffee beans to China, where coffee consumption is growing. And they say, oh, look at those poor Africans. They think they can become rich by exporting coffee to China. And then the next clip was riots in Kenya, where they say, oh, there are riots in Kenya because Kenya has to pay $12 billion this year in debt service to China, which is a complete lie. The riots were against a policy imposed by the International Monetary Fund on the government.
I even saw the signs they were carrying said, no IMF.
Yeah, it was not against China. And China's debt to Kenya is, I looked at the sheet. There's a sheet, the central bank of Kenya. This is what I do. I go to the central banks of those countries. I look at their debt sheet. There's a sheet you can read. Every country, I have one from Kenya. China is the largest bilateral lender. That when you come country to country, China is the biggest, yes, because China is a huge country. It has enormous cooperation with Africa and with Kenya. but it's not the largest lender. The largest lender, much larger than China, is Western bondholders who loan money to countries in crisis to fill short-term gaps at very, very high interest rates, 5% and above. China's loans, which is an important thing, these are long-term loans, usually 20 to 25 years long, at a 2% interest rate, which is very low. Actually, China could be losing money through these deals. But China's goal is not to make money from lending money to countries, but by creating wealthier partners. See, this is the Chinese game. Make Africa rich, and you will have a rich customer. Isn't it better to have a rich customer?
That's great.
Isn't it better to have a richer customer than a poor customer?
That's
really the Chinese philosophy. Make your neighbor rich so you can become rich yourself. So all this talk about the debt trap and stuff is nonsense. And what is going on, what will happen now in the coming years of the Belt and Road is this transfer of technology, which China now masters most of the important technologies in the world. And it's willing to export this technology and share it with others so that you can have more equal trade. You will have more European unions in Africa, in Asia, in Arab world. All those regions will become much larger than the European Union and even the United States. Those are the future markets and economic partners of China. China is thinking long term. They're not thinking about, this year or next season or next quarter. They think 2049 is the next goal. 2035 is a stepping stone. 2049. Africa 2063. Let's work on these long-term goals. And this is where the Chinese strategy is completely different than the Western strategy.
I really like your example, make your customer rich. That's a really great way to put it. That's an excellent way to phrase this. You've been attending forums all over the world. It's easy to notice if you're following your account on X. You recently attended the 70th anniversary of the Declaration of the 5 Principles of Coexistence, of Peaceful Coexistence in Beijing. Could you tell us about that? What does it mean for you as a Swedish person originally from Iraq?
Well, that was a very amazing, event. For me personally, it was the first time I attend such a very high-level event in person, where President Xi Jinping himself spoke. The whole Chinese leadership was there. There are also leaders from all over the world, current and former leaders. And well, there are hundreds of other people, experts, diplomats, former diplomats, and all kinds of people. And it was very, very, you can sense that it's a historic atmosphere there. And what I sense is that this is not about what happened 70 years ago when China and India and Myanmar signed these principles, which became a part of the non-alignment movement principles a year later in 1955. But this was not about the past, although the past is important because China achieved its enormous rise and growth and become the most powerful industrial nation on the planet without shooting a single bullet against another nation. Can you imagine that? So China's peaceful coexistence with other nations, which is the basis of its foreign policy, is now about the present and the future. These principles are very important for like the respecting the sovereignty of nations, non-interference in other nations' affairs, and so on and so forth, resolving conflicts through diplomacy. These are very important for today and the future because we have a situation in the world that, with the leadership of the United States and NATO, everything is solved with military means. We had since the Kuwait invasion. I am from Iraq. Iraq occupied Kuwait, and then there was this desert storm. Then the illegal invasion of Iraq. We had Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. We had Yugoslavia. We had Panama. Everything is solved with military means, and to what end? Destruction, all those countries where the United States and NATO has intervened are worse today than they were 30 years ago. So this shows the way forward, and the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence are actually in harmony with the United Nations Charter. The principles of the United Nations Charter are also respect of sovereignty of nations, non-interference in internal affairs, resolving conflicts with peaceful means, and so on and so forth. But what is important here is that nations should work for the benefit of the other. Like, as I said, you make your neighbor richer. This was actually embedded in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended 30 years of bloody religious wars in Europe. At the end of that war, people realized that everybody will be dead by the end of that conflict if it's not resolved. And they put together these principles of Peace of Westphalia, which it means that you respect your neighbor, although they have a completely different religious, cultural, social, and political system. But you don't go to conflict to change their situation. But what it said is that each nation should work for the benefit of the other. This is completely against the idea of the zero-sum game, of geopolitics. The game is to undermine the others and dominate yourself. The winner takes it all. Because one day they will grow up and they will beat you. So it's better you keep them weak. Keep everybody weak and stay on top of the chain, the food chain. This has been the British Empire, the French Empire, and unfortunately what is today the Anglo-American Empire. They keep everybody number 2 or number 3. You have to be number 1. Why you want to be number 1? It's a big responsibility. The Chinese don't want to be number 1. They avoid being number 1 because with great power comes great responsibility. They don't want to be number 1. They want to be equal with others. And this is also one of the principles of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, is the equality among nations. Doesn't matter how big and powerful you are or small you are equal to the others. And this is very, very important principle. So anyway, this was a very fascinating meeting. After the speech, the opening, there was a luncheon hosted by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China, Mr. Wang Yi, which I also, and our delegation, my colleague Stephen Brower, we attended. And it was a fantastic, relaxed atmosphere where I actually went forth to the minister and I gave him a copy of my book. He was very happy. He liked the cover picture where you have the Africans and Chinese working together. Oh, he said they are cooperating, look. And he liked it. He liked the cover. I also met Mrs. Delma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil, who is now the chairman of the director of the BRICS New Development Bank. Very, very important institution, because she has a very clear understanding. One of the projects we discuss here for the renaissance of Africa, what is very central in Africa, is the Grand Inga Dam in the Democratic Republic of Congo, because the Congo River is one of the mightiest rivers on the planet. And it has so enormous potential for hydropower. So this is the Grand Inga Dam, is a series of 8 dams together. They would produce twice as much as the Chinese Three Gorges Dam, like 40,000 megawatts of power. This will affect many countries in Africa. The problem has been so far is that they can't get financing for that, because this is a huge project. It could cost $20 billion maybe. And also there are technical issues, but the technical issues are solved now. China does have the technical capabilities. There are European companies. There was a Chinese hydropower, I guess, and a Spanish company. They got together a few years ago because the Congolese government, the DRC government, pressured them to get to an agreement. And they agreed at a preliminary agreement. But suddenly the World Bank withdrew from the project. It withdrew its support to the project. And this is one of the issues people don't understand, because the World Bank, the IMF, the United States, and Europe are not for this kind of big projects in Africa. They want small micro project, where it makes the donors feel good. You can make very nice videos, you make glossy brochures. Oh, look, we helped this small village in Africa. They can dig a well. They have clean water now. Give us more money. This does not change Africa. You cannot go with these very small projects. Or you can donate money to buy a goat to an African family. This was very big in Sweden in Christmas times, buy a goat
Yeah,
to an African. I mean,
in the United
it's
States,
like,
it's called heifer, I think.
yeah, something like that. And he said, what? People don't have electricity. People don't have roads. There's no clean water. There are no schools. So, they focus on these small things. So these large-scale projects are forbidden for Europe and the United States to support. Ethiopia had to struggle. And finally, they managed to raise money themselves for the dams, the hydropower projects, because the IMF, the World Bank, EU, the United States, they completely boycotted them. China helped in that sense. Now, Mrs. Delma Rousseff, as I mentioned, she also got a copy of this book. She made a speech in the BRICS summit in South Africa last year, where she discussed this question of credit for long-term, large-scale projects, that this is the game changer. And the BRICS new development bank is open for this. So anyway, this was the atmosphere at that luncheon was so great. And I was happy that I just walked to those people, said hello and met with them. And then there were 3 different forums. I spoke in one of them on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, but what do they mean for the world today? And interestingly, I was with a bunch of Americans, including Professor Graham Ellison. He spoke in the same forum I spoke at, and I made some remarks about his theory, the Thucydides trap, and I disagree with that completely because it's based on a false premise. The idea is that China is Athens and the United States is Sparta is completely wrong. That's the main premise of the story, and it's wrong. China is not Athens. The United States is not Sparta. So anyway, but it's a very cordial, very good atmosphere. I mean, we had the China-U.S. Chamber of Commerce director, an American. He spoke very well. We had some filmmakers who had very, very positive things to say. So it was a very, very friendly and hopeful atmosphere. Although the situation in the world was just going insane with the developments in Ukraine, but also the genocide going on in Gaza. So in that atmosphere, you are going to the celebration of this 70 years of peaceful coexistence. You go back to the hotel and you turn off the TV, and there's horrible things taking place in Gaza and Palestine, terrible conflict, endless conflict in Ukraine. And you say, so I want to go back to the first world. I want to talk about peace and development.
In the Global Times published your analysis of a survey on the Belt and Road, and I wanted to get your take on how is it perceived and what is your take on the Belt and Road?
Well, I said in my review of this survey, there were some surprising things actually in the survey, because there were 13 countries in the Belt and Road which were surveyed in Asia, Africa, Latin America. And one of the surprising things is that despite all the negative propaganda against the Belt and Road and China, people had a positive attitude in those countries towards China and the Belt and Road, that this was an important element in their own development. So that was surprising for me, actually. I thought that, the massive $300 million per year propaganda from the US Congress to smear China and the Belt and Road would have a huge effect. But not really. I was surprised to see that. The other surprising thing is that the people surveyed, they said, what is important about the Belt and Road is to build infrastructure and to get long-term, low-interest loans for infrastructure in their countries, because they think this is important for their development. Now, given all the insane propaganda about the debt trap, you would think people in those BRI countries are negatively positioned against infrastructure projects financed through loans from China. But they thought this is great. It should continue. It should have more loans from China for infrastructure projects. So this was also surprising for me. What was not surprising for me is what I mentioned, is that people in those nations, they want industrialization. They want modernization. They want China to contribute with technology so they could use their natural resources and human resources for their own development, not only for the development of China or the world. They want to have a share of that development by localizing the industries, bringing industries into Africa, into Asia, into the Middle East, and so on. So this was not really surprising for me because I know this is the general sentiment. Another not surprising aspect of this, but people felt that there is need for more people-to-people exchange. And this is, we all understand that people have very little understanding of Chinese history, culture, and the people. How are they as human beings? You know, people in Africa, the Middle East, unless you travel to China, you don't get a sense of that. And so therefore, there is this need for more people traveling to China, studying in China, because China has also opened the gates for young people from Africa, from Arab countries, and from Asia to study in China, which is great. But also there is more need of cultural exchanges between China and those countries. So people can understand China, but also the Chinese people also need to understand the cultural, the mindset, the history of those other peoples. So that is really something which, and so the survey points where the emphasis should be put, you know, continue working on long-term infrastructure projects, but also bring more benefits to those countries by industrialization and increase the people-to-people exchange. So these are important results from the survey, I think, noteworthy.
There's an interesting new initiative that Xi Jinping launched recently called the Global Civilization Initiative, which is doing just that, trying to bring people together from Africa, from the Middle East, from Latin America, from East Asia together to share the differences and similarities and celebrate one another's cultures. And I certainly hope that this can be a way to, you know, you're talking about family, a global family. I think that our family, our global family, really needs to sit down and have a dialogue between the various members of our family in order to better appreciate, celebrate, and even really love one another. And I think that is something the United States struggles with its concept of tolerance, where it just wants to put up with the other. China is seeking to embrace the other. What are
Exactly.
your thoughts?
That's a very, very important point because, you know, we are all humans at that, at that, you know, at the end of the thing. So it's not just tolerating each other, but what is the best thing in the other which we can, you know, like and actually associate with, because this is something which might be inside ourselves, but we are not aware of. So it's very, very important to understand what is the best in the other culture rather than tolerating the worst of the other.
Well, you know, this is something I think we agree on in some ways. In some parts, I think maybe you have a lot to say. So I wanted to know your opinion about China's green transformation. China is currently installing the world record-breaking amounts of solar, wind, offshore wind, and nuclear as well. And a lot of people have been suggesting that China uses its massive resources, its massive supply chain, to help developing countries like those in Africa develop green technologies. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think China is doing a great job at what they call the green transition, but the Chinese idea of green is different than the idea we have in the West. I wrote a whole paper. I analyzed two major papers issued by Chinese institutions in 2021 on the green transition. These are very thorough, thought through, you know, plans for China. The Chinese, the Chinese way of, you know, the green development is to solve problems positively, which means you, like, unlike we have here in the West, we have the environmentalist movement says you shut down the coal power, shut down the industry, shut down this. We don't want technology. We want to go back to nature. You know, we don't want modern medicine. We don't want space technology. We don't want space exploration. We don't want to waste money on the space while we have poor people on Earth. Everything is trying to solve it negatively. And this is destructive. China says, no, we need to use modern technology and science to do both, have a better environment, but also better living standards for our people and also the people in the world. So to be realistic, because you cannot have a good living standard without electricity, you need to increase the electric output. You need to increase building infrastructure. You need to build more modern industries. All these things are considered in the West as a disaster. This is not good. It should not be, propagated. I remember stories about China here in the West that they thought China's industrialization is a terrible thing. 1.4 billion people, drinking a beer every day, eating an egg every day. This would mean that the whole ecosystem will collapse. It did not, because China is doing other things to develop the environment, the afforestation projects, cleaning the rivers, cleaning this and that, building modern clean cities, now here comes the issue of the energy, because without massive energy, you cannot have a high living standard. Now, China is not proposing to shut down the coal power. China will peak its coal output by 2030. So China has not stopped. It's not going to stop using coal power, which I think is a smart thing to do. But then it will level the consumption and reach neutrality by 2060. Now, neutrality does not mean that you shut down the coal power. It means that you create a balancing act through greening the deserts, forests and so on, but also increasing the amount of renewable energy. Now, renewable energy is not only solar and wind, which are good complementary, but you have now in big investments in hydropower in China and nuclear power. So this is where you go into the future. Of course, you have gas and oil, but my view is it's not as smart to burn oil and gas because these are very valuable industrial products. You can turn them into industrial materials with a higher value. You don't need to burn them. So it's good that you go from internal combustion cars to electric cars. But this electricity is coming from coal, hydro, nuclear, and solar and wind and power. It's good for the image of China, of course, to speak about solar and wind power investments, which China can afford, because they have reached a high level of, industrialization. So they can afford to produce this at very affordable prices at a very large scale. They can do that. Europe cannot do that, in a cheap way. It's different. So we had campaigned for many, many years to develop nuclear power, fourth generation nuclear power, fusion power. But unfortunately, such industrial nations like Germany completely abandoned nuclear power and became hostage to coal and gas. Now the gas is gone. Germany is deindustrializing and, is like, we don't know where it will end. So that was not a smart policy. So Africa and the developing nations, it's not fair to ask them to do green transition and decarbonization because they have not even reached the first stages of industrialization. They have enormous fossil fuel resources because their contribution, even if we accept this idea of global warming created, man-made global warming through emissions of carbon dioxide, Africa's contribution to that is very, very minuscule. It's very, very small. African nations should be given the chance to reach a higher stage of living standards using their coal, oil, and gas for the first stage of development, but then they should go immediately into nuclear power. The hydropower I mentioned to you, the problem is that the United States, Europe, they don't want Africa to develop hydropower. They are against every hydropower project in Africa. So there's a lot of hypocrisy about clean energy in Europe and the United States. China is willing to help in all these fields, except for coal power. China took a decision because of its commitments to international climate regulations that it will not build coal power in Africa or outside China. They did build in Pakistan, which is important. Pakistan's big problem, financial problem, comes from the lack of electricity. They have to borrow dollar to buy oil and gas. So China is helping by building hydropower, nuclear power, and coal power in Pakistan, but also solar and wind. But the solar and wind is a very small portion of that mix. So that's where I disagree with this too much focus on solar and wind, and neglecting the fact that Africa would need to use this whole mix of energy resources to reach a certain stage of industrialization and modernization. And then from there, you move to the other solutions. And by that time, we will have created many new technologies. Our greatest hope is that we have fusion power, which is being enormously researched in China, most and foremost, but also in other countries, in the United States, that this would reach a commercial level so we can resolve. So we don't need to use all these other resources and use them, as I said, oil and gas should be used for other purposes other than burning for energy. So this is my position in the whole thing. I disagree with many people on that, but my main interest is economic development, especially in the developing sector.
I mean, what you said makes a lot of sense in terms of countries who have those kind of natural resources may be getting a lot of international pressure not to utilize them. And in terms of growing their economy and providing for their own people, it makes little sense if you're in those nations not to take advantage of those resources. It's a very it's a very fair argument. I want to ask you. I don't think we have enough time to get to every question I wanted to ask. So I'm going to just ask one or two more questions. And my next one is: you're originally born in Iraq. I just watched your interview with Fernando Muñoz Bernal, which was fantastic. I think everyone in the world who is interested in geopolitics needs to go watch that interview. Right after this, if you have time, go watch the interview on Fernando's channel with Hussein Askari on Iraq. We're just going to cover one aspect of that. In terms of now, because I think the U.S. is actually planning on leaving Iraq, if I understand, finally in the next couple of years. You were born there. Could you discuss the difference between how the U.S. developed or did not develop Iraq after or during its occupation, and how China is working with Iraq?
Yeah, in that interview, I was dealing with one very aspect of the relationship between the United States and Iraq, because immediately after the invasion of Iraq, which was illegal in 2003, the United States took over all the oil revenues of Iraq. They utilized a United Nations resolution for reconstructing Iraq, but because the United States being an occupation force, now they are under international law, are obliged to take care of the Iraqi economic situation and the living of the people under their occupation. So the United Nations created the Development Fund for Iraq, where all Iraqi oil exports money will be placed in that fund, and that fund's money, which is under the Iraqi central bank, will be used for reconstruction of Iraq. And, it sounds good. The problem was that the same day the UN resolution was taken, American President George H.W. Bush signed Executive Order 13303, where it's called, the protection of the Iraqi Development Fund and other assets in which Iraq has an interest, which made the Iraqi Development Fund part of the authority of the American president. So he is in control of the Iraqi oil revenues, all of them. So every year, the American president, because this is done under national security issues, and every year there's an assessment of the national security situation in Iraq, and the American president renews that executive order every year in May 2021. So Biden this year also in May 21st renewed that executive order. And all the Iraqi oil money since that time has been put in a bank account in the Federal Reserve of New York. And it's controlled by the US Treasury, not by the Iraqi Central Bank. And the United States gave as much money to the Iraqi government as needed for consumption. So the Iraqi government cannot plan on development. They cannot plan on reconstruction. And the United States government uses that as a leverage to force the Iraqi government to follow American policies. For example, not being friendly to Iran, Russia, China, and so on and so forth. So they direct Iraqi foreign policy through control of the money. Even internal policies in Iraq are controlled through the American ambassador, British ambassador, and so on. So this has been a very weird situation. Most people don't believe until today that this is happening, but that's the reality. Now, in the last 20 years, because of this system and also other problems, corruption, and so on, Iraq could not rebuild its infrastructure. Iraq in the 1980s was one of the most advanced countries in the region in terms of infrastructure, healthcare, education, technological advancement, industry, but all that was destroyed and all these, air campaigns where smart weapons were used to destroy all Iraqi infrastructure, all Iraqi industry. But that was not rebuilt. China and other countries, which is one paradox I discuss in this interview, is that actually the United States did not invade Iraq for the oil. Many people think the United States wants to control and take the Iraqi oil. The United States is not interested in oil. It's dirty. It's smelly. They are interested in the money of the oil. So actually the ones who developed Iraq's oil resources are Chinese, Russian, Malaysian companies, with technical support, of course, from Shell, Royal Dutch Shell. Exxon had a certain chunk, but they did not want Iraq to produce more oil to become a major player. Iraq only produced enough oil, so that money goes to the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, and then the United States dictates how that money is used. And so in those 20 years, also, Iraq was forced to pay every penny back to Kuwait as reparations. Every company which was working in Kuwait, after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, they had to leave. Iraq paid every penny. But look at China. Iraq owed China $8 billion in the 2000s because of trade and investments China did. It was not reparations. But China actually forgave Iraq $8 billion with a pence, draw in 2008. $8 billion like this, So, and China has been also working with the Iraqi government under restrictions by the United States to build power plants, some industries, develop the Iraqi oil industry, and so on and so forth. But it has not been allowed to do large-scale infrastructure projects. The Iraqi Prime Minister Adil Abdel Mahdi went to Beijing in 2019 and signed a massive agreement for exchanging part of the oil for infrastructure projects, industrial projects. As soon as he was back in Iraq, there was a color revolution waiting for him, pushed to a large extent by the United States and the EU and the other Iraq's neighbors, and that prime minister was overthrown. And the China-Iraq agreement has been suspended. So there's enormous pressure not to work with China and the Belt and Road. So this is a very egregious, incredible injustice being done to Iraq, but nobody notices it. It's colonial control of Iraq.
We don't have any more time, so we're going to see. We might have to cut something from the interview. I do have one last question. If you could try to keep it short as possible. What do you see as, because, we've talked about the Belt and Road enormously. We've talked about FOCAC enormously. What do you see of the role of BRICS? What is BRICS doing for the multipolar world that is emerging now?
Well, the BRICS has become a major, phenomenon for the paradigm shift in the world. It's taking place. The world has changed. The power structures of the world has changed, based mostly on the economic development potential and achievements that China is leading as a member of the BRICS, but also other members, India, Brazil, Russia, South Africa. So those nations are growing and getting out of the old structures. Now they are creating new structures for economic cooperation among themselves, but now inviting other nations with enormous potential for growth to join the club. So this is creating not an anti-Western system, it's a non-Western system, where its nations are more equal. They can share the technologies, they can share the financial benefits and the raw materials in their within which they control. For example, bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran and the United Arab Emirates into the BRICS means that the largest consumers of oil and the largest producers of oil are now in the same club. So the oil traders in London and Chicago are out of the game. Now these countries can determine the price of oil and the long-term contracts among themselves for fair prices among themselves. Financial resources in the Gulf countries can also be used now. Instead of buying real estate and financial paper and saving American banks, now they can be invested in infrastructure, industry, and agriculture in the Arab countries, in Africa, and in China and Asia. So you see there's a completely new dynamic which the BRICS represents and is the spearhead of that. And so China's role is very important, of course, in that it's the catalyzer of this whole development, including also in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Belt and Road Initiative. So all these things are creating a completely new dynamic in the world where the global South will move very, very fast from now on into modernization and industrialization and become independent of the monopolies created over centuries by the Western powers.
Okay, last question. This is not a question. Thank you so much for your answers. Where can people find you? What is your X account called?
It's at Hussein Askari, one word.
And what website should people go to read more of your work?
The Belt and Road Institute website is BRICS Sweden, BRICS with an X, sweden.org, O-R-G.
Thank you so much for your time, Hussein Askari.
Thank you too.